Welcome to the Kaleidoscope of Possibilities, alternative perspectives on mental health. My name is Dr. Adriana Popescu. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and leader in the field of mental health, energy psychology, addiction, trauma, and empowerment. In this podcast, we will be exploring mental health from a variety of perspectives, from the spiritual to the shamanic and beyond. What if mental illness isn't everything we think it is? What if everything we see as a pathology is actually a possibility? What else is possible with mental health?
Hi, everyone. Dr. Adriana Popescu here with you today with another episode of Kaleidoscope of Possibilities, alternative perspectives on mental health. I'm really excited to have with me as my guest today, Arlina Allen. She is a certified recovery coach, a certified hypnotherapist, the founder of Sober Life School, and the host of her own award-winning recovery podcast called One Day at a Time Recovery Podcast with over 300 episodes. She helps busy women quit drinking and create a life they love. Welcome, Arlina.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, happy to be here. Happy to be here with you and having this conversation because I know that we're going to find out all kinds of interesting things about you, your life, and the work that you're doing, which I think is very harmonious with some of the stuff that I am doing. So I'm excited to explore. But like I always start off the podcast, let's hear a little bit about you, your story, how you came to be doing this work that you're doing now.
Sure, thank you so much. I have to say, I was introduced to you by TJ Woodward, and he was like, "Oh, you have to reach her." And then I went to your website, and I was like, "Hot damn, she is like my sister from another mister," because we like all the same things, and I feel like we kind of came to the same conclusion. I got sober myself in April 23rd of '94, so it's been a minute. And over that time, I've just been obsessed with all things like personal development and self help and things like that. And I kind of came to the same conclusion you did that, a lot of this really centers around our identity and self worth, self esteem, all those things. And so, my work since I got sober on myself has been largely around things like emotion management and reshaping my identity because I was really sort of locked into this personality of being like the party girl. That was kind of my my self image, which was heavily influenced with denial because I was very much I don't know if addicted is the right word because I was like a binge drinker, but I was a big pot smoker and I loved to try. My joke was that I'll try anything twice, you know, except for heroin because I thought that would immediately lead to prostitution. So I decided not to do that. But yeah, should I tell you a little bit about like family of origin stuff maybe?
Sure, whatever you feel comfortable sharing that you think would be important for our viewers to know in terms of just getting an understanding of like how did you get to this point?
Right. So I always, when I do interviews, I always start with family of origin and childhood because I feel like that kind of sets the stage for everything else. And I'm a total oversharer, so you might have to reel me in. But and I've done a ton of therapy over the last 30 years, so which has been good in the sense that I've been sort of desensitized to things like the trauma that happened to me when I was little. There was a couple of things particularly that I really feel shaped my identity. I was sexually abused by a neighbor starting at the age of 5, and I'm not really sure how long it went on for. It was probably a few years. And my parents divorced when I was 7. And those two things, coupled with the fact that I was going to church a lot, my dad was super religious, and we were going to a Christian church. And I got these messages that I was supposed to be good. And there wasn't a lot of room for like human frailties or making mistakes and things like that. And so I got this idea in my mind that I was supposed to be perfect. And there were things that were happening to me that I couldn't reconcile those two competing. I think there's a clinical term for that. It's like two opposing. Do you know?
Cognitive dissonance.
Thank you. I always forget what that is. That might be part of drugs, maybe my age. I'm not sure, but I can't remember. I keep losing that one. But yeah, I was aware that I was supposed to be living this kind of standard, and there were some things happening to me, and I couldn't reconcile the two. And I kept trying to be good, but failing. I felt like I was failing. And then because of what was happening, I felt like I was just bad. And, when I was in recovery, I used to joke around that at one point I decided that if I couldn't be good, then I was going to be good at being bad. And you kind of made a joke out of it. That's kind of how I process things. Deflect is with humor. But at the core of that, I got into therapy much later. What I realized is that my core belief was that I was bad. I had no context or perspective from like an adult's perspective that it was not my fault. There was a part of me that felt that it was my fault. Even my parents' divorce. I thought if only I could have been better, then that wouldn't have happened. I had no idea it had nothing to do with me. But anyway, so that kind of set the stage, right? And I was raised by my mother, who was born and raised in Mexico City, and I was with my older sister. She was 2 years older than me. And my dad was very present in my life. He was a good man. He lived not too far away, and he would come visit me. He was probably one of the most decent and honest men I've ever met. He's a really good dude. But there were some things about my relationship with him. This standard was very difficult to meet. And he had this thing where he is very analytical, and he would debate me as a child. It was really an unfair thing happening. And I think he was trying to instill critical thinking in me. So I think his intentions were good, but it created a lot of self-doubt and a lot of external seeking. And same with my mom. When I was growing up, she had two predominant feelings. She was either really happy or really angry. And I kind of felt like she saved her happy face for the outside world. And to be fair to her, she was a single mom raising two kids. She was working full time. When she got home, she was tired. And I don't know if it's a cultural thing, but in the Mexican culture, the girls are really expected to be able to do like all the household chores very young, right? And I was a slob by nature. I came very now, like being messy was sort of my thing. I had nicknames like Pigpen, I was just a very free spirit. And I had an older sister who was like my polar opposite. She was the compliant child, straight A's, she was quiet. I was none of those things. And anyways, so I just feel like my poor little self-esteem was just taking hit after hit. There was a lot of emotional neglect. My parents were working, they just weren't around. And I feel like that was really common. I'm 55. So when I was growing up, I was like the era of the latchkey kids. Like you come home from school, you let yourself in, you lock the door, don't answer it, don't, all that stuff. Um, yeah, but my mom just didn't have the tools for helping me navigate my feelings. She didn't notice. And years later, and I was doing some trauma therapy, I realized when I was growing up, my mom used to tell these stories about how I almost died, but she would tell them like as a funny story, which sounds kind of weird. But she would tell them like, oh, I had such an adventurous spirit. Like when I was in diapers, she lived on a busy street. She was washing the car, and I was in diapers, and I followed the water in the gutter all the way down the street and around the corner. And a neighbor lady noticed I was outside. She picked me up, and I guess she knew who I was. She brought me home, and she's like, "Are you missing something?" And my mom would tell the story like it was funny. And I didn't get it. And I was like, why do I have like such a strong need for safety as an adult? It makes it hard to take risks and be authentic and all that stuff. And doing some of this trauma therapy. And that was just like one incident. There was one where I almost drowned, and my uncle he was 10 years old, and pulled me out of the water by my hair. I was standing next to my mom. She didn't notice that I was drowning. But these were all sort of in the tone of funny and me being adventurous. Right. And it wasn't until I did the trauma therapy that I realized I almost died, and she would tell the story like it was funny. So anyway, that kind of sets the stage. And then I started drinking at a super young age. And, in junior high, I was drinking before school, but I was still like I wasn't getting into any trouble. And it wasn't until I was 23 years old that I was really suffering the consequences of my drinking and using, and had a really bad night with my sister. It involved the police, but I didn't get arrested for some reason. But the next morning I knew something had to change. But it took me 2 years of moderation. I was trying to moderate my drinking before I came to the conclusion that I was one of those people who just shouldn't drink. So did the whole 12-step thing. And that's when sort of, I thought it was the end. Turned out it was just the beginning, right? Because that's when life really opened up for me. And I started to learn about who I was and how to heal, but how to create the kind of life that I wanted to live. And so I've really been kind of obsessed with that ever since. And that was in 1994.
Wow. Well, congratulations on your 30 years.
Thank you.
30, yes, right?
Yeah, I just turned 30. Yeah. And that's
Um,
good.
I want to explore, a number of things you addressed, but this idea, let's start here actually. We'll come back to the core beliefs, but the moderated drinking. I think that's an interesting one because there's a lot of people, I think in the general public, people who are not familiar with the process of addiction and recovery, who think that you could just cut back and be fine, or just avoid the substance in question and be fine, or go to a rehab program for 30 days and you'll be cured. And I feel like these are giant misnomers and misperceptions people have about how this actually works. Can you clarify some of that for us?
Yeah, I mean, I can see how this misperception can happen, right? Because we do see that there are people who can go their entire lives drinking moderately and not have an issue, right? And the idea of addiction, have come to understand it as a spectrum, right? There's the people who don't drink at all, and then there's the people who do it occasionally. There's those weirdos who drink a have a glass of wine and are like, "Ooh, I'm feeling it," and they put it down. I've never understood that. um, and then it kind of progressively gets more and more intense to where you see these types of people who are living on the street. They are addicted physically, mentally. They have mental health disorders that are really severe. I think what a lot of people do is they look at the extreme dysfunction and go, well, I'm not like that, so I must be okay. Right. And there is so much pressure in our society to drink, right? And plus it feels good, and it's very, becomes a coping mechanism for some people, even if it's like a mild stress management. And listen, I have learned not to make blanket statements. I know what's right for me. I can share with people what I've seen. And it's been my experience that once you kind of cross this invisible line, meaning you can no longer predict your behavior once you start drinking, once you start blacking out, once you start breaking promises to yourself. There are things like it interrupts your sleep at night. So you're kind of on this cycle. If it gets worse and worse, I've understood it to be like a progressive thing, right? And so once you kind of cross that invisible line, there really is no going back. It's like a kink in a hose. Once the hose has been kinked in that area, it will always kink in that area. Right. So I have not seen people really, actually, I take it back. I have seen people, I worked in this program with these women who had gone to jail for issues around crime around drug use. And when they get out, they don't do drugs anymore, but they drink. And I'm like, okay, well, it's manageable to some extent because they can hold a job and do all that stuff, but they don't do drugs anymore. And listen, I'm not one to judge, but if someone comes to me and they say they want to stop, I typically suggest that if you haven't made the decision or come to your own conclusion that you cannot moderate your drinking? I feel like that's a super important question to answer. Can I moderate my drinking? And so my suggestion is to come up with some kind of plan. And if you can't stick with your plan for like 6 months, chances are, I mean, I realize that sounds like a long time, but if you can't moderate, then it's time to look at other alternatives.
Right. Right. And I often will give the clients who are in that contemplation, we talk about stages of
Contemplation.
change, right? They're in contemplation around having an addictive issue. Like, do I not? I don't know. They're not yet clear. And it isn't so black and white as, yes, I'm fully addicted alcoholic or I am not. There's many, many shades in between as you're illustrating. And I think that, one of the things I've often suggested to folks is if you're not sure, try an experiment. I remember one time giving a client the only experiment she would agree to was to drink 1/2 glass less of wine per day. She was drinking a bottle of wine a day.
That's 4
To drink,
glasses.
right. To drink 1/2 of a glass less and to do that for a week. And guess what? She tried it. She could not do it. And that was the thing that clicked for her, like, wow, like I'm actually not in control of my drinking. I can't even do a small reduction in once I get started. And that propelled her to realize that, wow, I actually need more help than I thought. I can't moderate on my own. I need to go to a residential program where I'm away from alcohol for a period of time and do the deeper work. And that was the other piece I wanted to bring in, because I feel like so often, people are told, well, just avoid it, stay away from it, throw away your dealer's number, don't go to liquor stores. And it isn't that simple. So can you share with us a little bit about your perspective of why it is not that simple?
Yeah, the funny thing is that quitting drinking really has nothing to do with the alcohol. It's just drugs, alcohol are a symptom of a deeper problem. People do them. It's typically out of stress management or emotion management. They want to feel better. They want to calm down. It's either anger or happiness, or they want to run. It's some kind of stress. I mean, even happiness can be a stress. I know some people, their triggers are not when they're sad or tired or whatever. It's when they're happy, like they want to go celebrate. Something good happens, that kind of triggers that desire to drink. But yeah, I feel like it's just a symptom of a deeper problem, right? And drinking is a coping mechanism, it's a strategy. And so a lot of times, once we come to the conclusion, yes, I do want to practice abstinence. It's not, is it causing anything bad? It's like, is it really worth it? Like, is it bringing you anything good? And I would argue that it probably isn't worth the cost. It interrupts your sleep. It raises your baseline of cortisol when you're not drinking, so that at the end of the day, you actually feel, that cortisol is that hormone of stress. And so you feel more anxious and tired at the end of the day. So it kind of kicks in that desire to want to have a drink and relax at the end of the day. But people drink to feel better, or to feel different. And so my perspective is that there are other ways to arrive at the same goal. So there's so many other things. I was so intrigued by your website because I know you have a bunch of other. I'm going to interview you pretty soon, and I can't wait to get into all the tools that you have, because you have some that I've never heard of. I think they kind of all boil down to some of the same basic principles. There's this idea that time heals all wounds. And I just feel like that is the biggest lie on the planet. The pain waits. Two thumbs down.
Two thumbs down. It lives
Yeah.
in your body. It lives in
Yeah.
your subconscious mind, or
Yes.
whatever we want to call it. It doesn't just go away.
It
Trauma
doesn't.
in particular doesn't just go away with time.
It doesn't go away with time. And the good news is there are many tools. Some are free, some are not. You can do this. I've heard of this patchwork recovery method where you pull from. I did a combination, like when I got sober, I did a combination of peer support and professional support. So 30 years ago, there really wasn't anything other than a 12-step program. So I did it, loved it. Like I had such a positive experience. Now, there are some guidelines. I'm writing a book called A 12-Step Guide for Skeptics. And in it, it's like, well, here are some of the barriers to entry. Here are some things that you need to watch out for, and I differentiate the difference between the steps and the fellowship. The fellowship is the community aspect of it. And I feel like the community aspect can make or break your experience, because it has been around for so long now, 80 plus years, I think, that there's sort of like a vernacular within this community, like a certain kind of lexicon. There's certain things that are repeated frequently that are not actually in the literature, which drives me a little crazy. Right. And some of it can be a little shamey. And so my position is the 12 steps are a worthy endeavor, and that there's a safe way to do it that doesn't feel shamey. And I think if the founders had the information that we do now, they probably would have changed some of the term character defects. Like I prefer human frailties, or really their survival skills is what they are. Like, we develop these survival skills. And so I would change a little bit of that. But I'm all about interpret the program in a way that makes sense for you. Like, God turns into higher power, the universe, source, what energy, whatever. Um, and things like character defects, that turns into, listen, the truth is we're doing some things wrong and we want to know what those things are. There's some character traits that are positive and some that are negative. So we really want to address the negative, but let's do it in a way that's compassionate, a little more compassionate and empathetic. Yeah.
Blaming and shaming is part of the problem of why people are drinking in the first place or using drugs, right? So it just fuels more of that, what TJ would call the toxic shame. But I want to come back to something that you said, which and go a little deeper with it, because I think it's so important. Is you basically talked about addictive behavior as a coping strategy. Like,
Yeah.
you're using it to try to feel better. You're using it to try to maybe numb some pain. Something else is going on. And that's the thing we need to get to the root of. Oftentimes, people go for the obvious. Well, maybe there's unresolved emotion. There's maybe grief that has never been processed, or trauma that's never been dealt with. But I want to come back to, your area in particular of interest, and mine as well, because I wrote about this in my book, about the belief system, and what TJ would call the BS systems. See, that's what he likes to refer to them as. So can you talk about that piece, and how does the way, like, the things we come to believe about ourselves, like you shared in your story, feeling like a little kid that you were bad, that you were wrong, right? You came to believe that. How do these core beliefs actually drive addictive behavior?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I sort of came to the conclusion that we only allow into our lives what we believe we deserve on a subconscious level. Like, our brain is really good at, we're all seeing the same things, but we're not all seeing the same things. Like, I have a lens that I look through, right? And this lens that I look through is based on my personal experiences and the beliefs and conclusions that I have come to about myself and the world. And I was so dissociated from my pain. I really didn't know that I had trauma, which, would seem obvious, right? But it wasn't to me. It wasn't obvious to me that I had trauma, because I thought I was complicit, or I, went along with it. But I was 5, I didn't understand that you can't give consent, and that, the groom, anyway, it was a mess. But, so the way that plays out in my adult life is I'm dissociated from my feelings, but somewhere in my mind, there is like, I'm not good enough, right? So, a good way, one of the ways that I learned to identify my limiting beliefs, because I wasn't emotionally attached to them. I mean, once I got sober, I was like this raw nerve ending. I felt everything, and it was very disorienting for a period of time, but things did settle down. But I have this exercise where it was like, because people, you have to meet people where they're at. When I first got sober, I just thought I was a party girl that drank too much, and I was blacking out, doing all these crazy things. I wake up and I'd be like, what was that all about? Like, I was so, it was funny. I was so self-centered, but I was incapable of self-examination. It's like, I don't even know how that happens. But I was just like baffled. I didn't know why I really did not know why my life was such a mess. And I did a 4-step and got some clarity. But later I realized it gets, once you stop drinking and stuff like that, then it's shades of gray. So I do this exercise where I say, it's like, what do you want and why don't you have it? And if you make that list, let's say like for me, I always thought I always thought I would be rescued. Like I thought money or men were gonna be the things that I thought it was love or love or money. I thought those were the things that were gonna save me, redeem me. And so I was like, why can't I find the love? Why can't I find the money? And if I would write down, why didn't I get the money? It's like, well, I'm not smart enough. I'm inconsistent. I'm too, whatever. I'm too wild. I'm too whatever, rough around. You know, it was like, oh, well, if I look at those statements individually, it's like, oh, I have this belief that I'm not smart enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not lovable. I'm not worthy. And those so those were sort of like the clues to my limiting beliefs. And then it became a process of reframing those. And I just want to take a step back and say my understanding of a belief is an idea that's repeated over and over again until your subconscious mind believes it as truth. The funny thing is that beliefs aren't necessarily true, right? Like, I thought I was a bad person, but it wasn't true. And so I just chose people to be around that were unkind because that reflected how I felt about myself. I would go for these big jobs, but I would sabotage them like subconsciously, show up late, say something inappropriate, skip a meeting, like I was doing these things and I was like, I know what to do, but I'm just not doing it. There was like a knowledge behavior gap. And in that gap were, in the subconscious mind, that's where all my beliefs and standards were. So it was really and I needed help. There's this idea that you can't read the label from inside the jar, right? I was in the jar and I couldn't see why I was the way I was, and I needed an outsider's perspective to help me kind of sort out all my stuff. And that was when the 4-step, was really good for me. I got to list out, all my resentments, and it got into cause and effect. And there's the process for people who don't know what a 4-step of the 12-step program is. It's a searching and fearless moral inventory. And you start off with naming the people that you're resentful at. And I was like, "License to bitch, sign me up. Somebody has to listen to all my bullshit. Are you kidding me?" I couldn't wait. So you get really specific about the cause and then how it affected you and then your part, like what was your role in it? And it was so funny. I was so delusional. I didn't realize I had a part. And after working with somebody, it's like, oh, these people are so mean to me. And they would say or do things that really hurt my self esteem, my emotional security, financial security, my relationship. There was like these underlying fears. And then when we would get to my part, and I'm a victim. I have no idea why. Right. And then they would gently ask me questions like, well, what happened right before they said that? And I would be like, oh, well, and then you realize it was like that awkward moment where you realize you're the asshole. It's like, oh, they were actually behaving in response to something I had done. Right? And then there was like all this, like I was controlling, I was taking inappropriate responsibility for others, and I wasn't taking responsibility for myself. There was a lot of self abandonment. There was a lot of me showing up to abusive relationships, but I was hurting me. I was abandoning me. I was showing up where I shouldn't have. Right. And so it was a really interesting process of, you know, and then all these expectations I had of others, unreasonable demands is what they were. And so a lot of the process was about letting go of what wasn't mine so that I could bear the weight of what was. Right. And I did it with love, with people who were loving and compassionate and sharing with me. It's like, oh, you're angry at these people for abusing you, but then you realize you were the one that practiced self-abandonment. You were the one who abused you. It's you're the one that you're mad at, right? And all these things went back to like, how did it affect me? It was like, well, no wonder my self-esteem and my self-worth was so low. It was like this self-fulfilling prophecy of me putting my standards were so low. I was hanging out with these people that were abusive or toxic, and they would behave in a certain way, and it would damage it was just like this vicious cycle. So, um, I was lucky that I got professional help and sponsorship to help me sort of to go through that whole sorting process and then be conscious, like from a day to day basis, like using things like prayer and meditation and, journaling and things like that. These kinds of practices that were free, a lot of them were free, but it just took patience and persistence to just keep practicing. And over time, I found my judgments of myself and others softened. And, there's this idea that you can't escape the same measuring stick that you judge others by. As I gained compassion for my coping strategies, my survival skills, I also began to forgive those other people that I thought were hurting me. I learned how to create boundaries for myself mostly, right? I'm a little bit of a workaholic. I realize that I can't expect too much out of myself. Like I recognize where my limits are now. And the end result is a very, peaceful life. I have a very peaceful marriage. I have two grown kids who've never seen me loaded. Um, Outside of I had surgery on my knee and had to take a bunch of medication, but I did it very appropriately, intentionally. And so I went off on a tangent, but I hope that was helpful in some way.
Oh yeah, no, I'm loving it. Yeah, I mean, we have to first become aware,
Yeah.
right? The thing about these beliefs is that mostly they're subconscious.
Yes.
Where it's like the analogy I often use is the computer. Here we are on computers, we just see what works on the front end. We don't see all the programs that somebody had to, do these extensive programs that are causing the computer to run.
Yeah.
Many of us are not conscious of our own programs.
No.
We do not understand that these start so young in life. I mean, even, in the womb. I mean, think, I always say you're swimming around inside this person for 9 months. You think you're not absorbing all of their belief systems and their traumas and their emotional stuff and whatever they picked up from their mom and it's like intergenerational. I mean, that's how this stuff starts. And then we sometimes get those direct messages, like you kind of got messages from religion and your dad about sin and bad and wrong and right and all the things. And then sometimes we believe, and I wanted to come back to this too, sometimes we come to believe as children that if something bad happens to us, it is our fault, because we're taught that very simple: if I'm good, I get rewarded. If I'm bad, I get punished. So how is a child supposed to make sense of abuse, right? You have no way of understanding, wow, maybe this person is mentally ill, or maybe they were abused, or maybe they're crazy, or whatever it is. You don't understand that. You think if they're doing this to me, it must be my fault in some kind of. And so the seeds get planted for these beliefs. They grow. Then, of course, like you said, we end up attracting that which we believe is true about ourselves. And then you see where it ends up. And then, yes, people, once they're in this addictive state, they get in that shame spiral, and then the things they do when they're drinking and using are create more shame. And so then they're like, oh, I better keep drinking and using because, right. And now they're stuck in all that. But you did say something important about victim consciousness that I do want to highlight, which is this idea that which is another core false belief, and I really like using that term. I think TJ was brilliant in coining that. They are fundamentally false, but this core false belief that that things happen to me and I do not have the power to change them. Can you
Mm.
say more about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. As I interviewed Dr. David Spiegel from Stanford, he's kind of famous for hypnosis and things like that. And I had to ask him, it's like, why is it that victims of rape, um, sexual abuse, there's this reoccurring theme that they experience guilt, and he suggested that. Powerlessness at its root is so painful that we sort of subconsciously assume responsibility because it's easier to feel guilt than powerless. I thought that was so interesting, and it really kind of felt true for me um, that to feel powerless is like one of the worst feelings I could feel. It's like that vulnerability that And this idea that it changed who I was fundamentally. And but there is a, this victim mentality is kind of interesting because I was a victim like that. I was victimized, but it was how I took responsibility in the form of guilt. And that was kind of like one of the things that was a pattern for me, was not taking appropriate responsibility for myself. It was easier for me to like try to control the people and things outside of myself so that I felt control on the inside. Right. But I had this inability to, yeah, it was just all really messy for me at first until I got some clarity. Because the truth of the matter is I have learned that we are way more powerful than we realize. Even the victim persona is actually very powerful in the sense that, um, I heard one time that it's the sickest person that in the relationship that controls it. And it rang true for me. So for me, it was a form of control, but it's a very painful place to be, and it kept me stuck in repeating behaviors I didn't wanna repeat. And so I learned that I could actually take my power back by letting go of things like blame and judgment of others, right? And it was this idea that I don't know if I can explain it right, but there's someone in your life that you don't like, and it's like they are making me, feel bad, or they're making me crazy, or these, and it's like, look, do you really want these people to be in control of your emotions? It's like I had to find a way to take my power back, and that was in the form of setting boundaries with myself and others, like being very mindful about um, who I spent time with and like at work, it's hard to do. Like they say, have you heard that idea that we sort of recreate our family of origin at work?
Oh, I see it every day at work.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, it's an opportunity to sorta heal those relationships, and a little strategy I learned, what because I was attracted to these toxic people at work, right? But I learned that there was, like, a few things I could do. Number 1, I could stop sharing. I could stop sharing my thoughts and beliefs, because when I'm sharing, it's like usually in like a character assassination kind of way, like a gossipy way. I used to love to gossip. It just made me feel better about myself. All the focus was on the outside. I was the victim, don't you know? But it just felt gross. Like internally, it just doesn't feel good. And so I stopped. There were, people at work. I had to stop sharing. I would listen, but I would walk into a conversation saying, I only have 15 minutes. It's difficult to completely disengage with people at work, right? So sometimes you have to manage it and let that relationship die on the vine by just slowly withdrawing. So it started with having an exit strategy. So like I can only talk for 15 minutes at lunch or whatever. And then they would go into their thing and start gossiping or character assassinating. And I would say, how did that make you feel? Tell me more about that. So I didn't have to share anything. It wasn't about me at all. And then 15 minutes would come up and I'd be like, oh, I got some place to be. You know, I would go walk outside or take a phone call. Do you know what I mean? Like I like would remove myself from the situation. And so that allowed me to like conserve my energy for the evening when I needed it, just yeah, just those toxic relationships can be really difficult to manage.
Agreed. And really, the boundaries, I always say boundaries are for you. They're not for the other. No one else is going to really, you can't control whether or not they're going to cross your boundary. It's about what are you going to cross?
Yeah, and the exercise for me about setting a boundary with somebody else was not that they would honor my boundary. It was so that I didn't betray myself with silence. Right? Like there's that idea of you speak your truth without blame or judgment. Those I statements like, I'm really uncomfortable talking about these people. Why don't you tell me like what's your favorite book? What podcast are you listening to? I don't know, just like change the subject, right? Um, but there is, and it's a funny thing because in 12-step programs, there's this idea that we are powerless over people, places, and things. That's one of those things that you'll hear a lot. But I disagree. I do feel like we have influence right? Like you can influence something with your energy, and energy is so powerful. And it's like, you walk into a room, if you were walking into a room, there are two people and you could cut the tension with a knife. It's like we feel it. We can feel it. Or you go to a concert and just the energy is electric and it just sweeps you up in it. So I do feel that we can influence our environment with our own energy by staying focused, by resolving, challenging feelings, negative feelings in our own process, whether that's like I'm a big believer in like processing to resolution. Tara Brach has that great rain meditation. And so it's like 11 minutes and 31 seconds. And it's a way I do that in the mornings to sort of process negative feelings. So it's like acknowledge, feel them, and then keep it moving, so that I can just like manage my day and my relationships better.
Mhm. Arlina, was there anything in particular, like modalities or techniques that you found particularly helpful in your recovery journey?
So, the 12 steps were huge for me, but I also did cognitive behavioral therapy for a long time. I did something called process therapy. Um, Practicing prayer and meditation and journaling was a huge tool for me. It was interesting. So there's something called a 10 step. It's like at the end of the day, you kind of do this, you evaluate the day. And it was a way for me to sort of address challenges, but also stay focused on my positive character traits, right? Positive character traits that bolstered my self-worth, things that didn't have anything to do with my appearance, my achievement, or a role that I was playing, right? So it was my inherent. It was like things like I'm playful, I'm trustworthy, I'm compassionate, I'm kind. And I would keep this list at the forefront. I wanted to, problem solve, like where did I go? Where was I off base? Do I need to clean anything up in relationships? Because I was pretty all over the place in the beginning. So it was very helpful for me to sort of identify where my red flags or pitfalls and all that stuff was. You can learn about something, but until you like play it out in life, it doesn't really feel real, right? So it was a really good practice for me, but it was I tried to mostly focus. I was encouraged to focus on my character assets, right? Like you want to be real and no toxic positivity or anything like that, but have a good balance of both. And so those were tools that really, and honestly, being super self-centered as I can be, calling people, like, people would hand me their phone numbers, like, having a support system, basically, people that I could call, and so when I started sponsoring other women, I would always suggest to them that they do something called willingness calls, and it's just like a willingness to connect, a willingness to, because all this trauma and stuff that a lot of us have, the instinct is to isolate. Like when I'm in pain, I was sent to my room. So when I'm in pain as an adult, I want to isolate, right? But really, connection is where I get the healing for me. And so I would tell these women that I work with, and I still do now, make the effort to connect on a regular basis with like two or three people, because when life happens and your brain is thrown offline, there's this saying that we don't rise to the level of our expectations, we fall to the level of our training. And if I have trained myself to call regularly, then when life happens, I have a few people that I'm already in the habit of calling, and I don't have to give the backstory because we're already current. Right. If one person's not available, I can go down the list and try a few people, because there's something about connecting and sharing my feelings that helps me process them to resolution, like when I'm super triggered. So that I would probably say, starting from the very beginning, that was a tool that I utilized to help me, manage those really painful feelings. And then EMDR and all kinds of therapy and hypnotherapy. Like I did all the things. I love therapy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And that's the piece of working with professionals who are trained in these
Yeah.
really powerful healing modalities that can really address like the trauma and all these things. So, I think that's wonderful. And thank you for being so vulnerable and sharing all of that. So if we bring it to today, tell us about what you're up to now. I know you have this very popular podcast that you're hosting, and you
Mhm.
also work with people as well, right? So tell us more.
So I actually have 2 podcasts. So, about 6 months ago, I started a second podcast because I'm a little bit of a workaholic, but it's called the Self-Help Junkie Podcast, and it really came from this place of I have been a self-help junkie since I got sober. Actually, even before that, I was doing, like, Tony Robbins workshops and stuff like that. I just became obsessed, and it became like another distraction. Right? I would get like this dopamine hit, like I hear a podcast and go, "Oh my gosh, that's amazing. These ideas are amazing." And I want to share it with my friends. I try to talk to my husband about it and he kind of glazes over, so so I do have the addiction recovery podcast, but that has been amazing. It's been almost 8 years, and I've been able to talk to some really cool people. And I interviewed Elizabeth Gilbert recently, but like Dr. Anna Lemke, and just like some really cool people. I'm just so grateful. I don't even know how to describe it, but I'm just so grateful for it. And but this new one is really a lot of fun because we take a topic, talk about what it is, why it's important, and then we come up with 3 action items. So there's this idea that mood follows action. So even in 12 step, they always talk about it's a program of action. So if you want a different experience, you have to take a different action. So it's been a fun project to do the self-help junkie, but I also do one-on-one coaching. I had an experience where I went to someone after my father died to do, actually, it was for an unrelated thing. Like I thought, oh, I seem to have these blocks. Like I've been trying to write this book forever and I was really struggling with it. Like, oh, I wonder if it's a confidence issue. It must be a self esteem issue. And when I went through the hypnosis process, I had to really reprogram my mind around all the messages that I got around my father. But I also he had died and I hadn't really processed his death. And by processing all of that, it really freed me up. Like, it was just so interesting, and that's what I found in recovery, sometimes 2 things that's like I'm struggling over here, but because I'm dissociated and have this stuff buried so deep, like, I don't actually know what the problem is. If I knew what it was, I would have solved it already, right? So, it was really interesting. So I had such a profound experience that I went and got certified to do it with my clients. And it's really about doing the deep work. I get a lot of women who have already been sober for a while, but they get stuck, right? And just need to get to that subconscious, deep subconscious beliefs and reframe those past experiences where those limiting beliefs were established, right? And and for a lot of people that are, abstinent, it's a great drug-free process to I know there's a lot of like new things people are trying nowadays, but if you want to go the drug-free way, hypnosis is a great way to go.
Hmm. Yes, very, very powerful stuff. Well, I really enjoyed our conversation today. I think we've covered a lot of really important topics, and I love that you're out there, preaching to those who will listen. Like, same here, right? Like trying to get this information out there, trying to inspire people, trying to give them hope, because I think one of the worst parts about addiction is how hopeless people get and powerless they can feel. And to give them hope, to let them know that, hey, there are tools and strategies that can work. If you want to get out of this, you can. There's support out there for you. So I love that you're part of that.
Thank you.
If people want to find out more about you and your work or your podcasts, where can they go?
I would direct people to soberlifeschool.com. There's actually a free guide that they can get there. It's the How to Quit Drinking 30 Tips for Your First 30 Days. It's a free download. It's some of like, if you're just starting out, actually, even if you've been sober for a while, it's like all the best things that I've learned over the last 30 years. And so that's a good place to start. There's a link to the podcast and coaching and all that stuff is on there too. So,
Fabulous. We'll be
yeah.
sure to include those in the show notes. Any final thoughts for us?
No, I mean, I'm just in alignment with you. There is hope. There was a time when I thought I was fundamentally broken. And as it turns out, I was wounded and just needed some healing. So there is hope. Things can get better.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Arlina. Thank you so much, audience, for tuning in today. If you've liked this podcast, please do review it, rate it, share it, comment, whatever you need to do to help us get it out there in the world. And see you next time on Kaleidoscope of Possibilities. Dr. Adriana signing off.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of Kaleidoscope of Possibilities, Alternative Perspectives on Mental Health. This has been Dr. Adriana Popescu. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe and share with others. To find out more about me, my guests, and more, please visit my website at adrianapopescu.org. See you next time.